Now, all that is very interesting. And now we get into the part of the lecture that I found it all really interesting, but this is part that really rings true for me as somebody that likes to study people's worldviews and get to know that aspect of cultures, which is, if you lived 300 years ago, how might you view the world? What would you have had as your kind of main values? How did you view the world, how it functioned? Kind of what was your spirituality and value system and philosophy? So that's what we'll touch on now. A lot of what we've been talking about with hunting and fishing and clans and Geshka leadership, plant gathering, it can seem kind of like, oh, we're going to talk about this, then this, then this, then this, like these isolated things. But the thing to understand is that that Dena'ina society traditionally was very much what we sometimes call a non-differentiated society, or basically communities where everything or lots of things were tied in together. Kinship was tied in with hunting, as we've already seen, fishing and plant gathering. But fishing and gathering and hunting were also tied in with spirituality. So for example, the idea that you should only take a certain amount of a plant and that you should show respect for plants when you gather and that you should ask for permission from plants when you gather. So there's clearly like spiritual connections with how you gather plants. And so there's a lot of connectedness going on here, and it all points to kind of a broader worldview. And that's a worldview that we understand parts of and that we don't understand perfectly because we don't have a time machine. And because, of course, societies have changed a lot in 300 years. Every society has changed a lot in the last 300 years. But there are some things that we do understand that we've learned about that I think are fascinating indicators of sort of how people were thinking about the world back then. And that to some degree have carried over into people's lives today who are descended from these communities. One book that you might consider reading is A Dena'ina Legacy by Peter Kalifornsky. I would also recommend Shem Pete's Alaska by, among other people, Shem Pete. And there's other great books as well, Dena'ina Plant Lore by Priscilla Carey. But in A Dena'ina Legacy, Peter Kalifornsky tells he's a famous writer, Dena'ina writer, one of the first Dena'ina writers. And he was based out of Kenai, although he'd been a variety of places in his life, but he was based out of Kenai. And he wrote a bunch of stories that he remembers being taught basically in the 1910s from elders that he was digging clams with, among other things. So he's remembering stories that go back at least to the mid-1800s. And he shares some of them in his writings and books, including the ones that I had you read about the old Dena'ina beliefs and the mouse story. And I would like you to think for a minute and pause the video and think, what did I learn about Dena'ina life or culture back then from that reading? In Mouse Story, or you might review it in your mind and think, what happened? What was going on with the young man? And who was the mouse really? Because as we saw, right, the mouse was not just a normal everyday mouse, were they? And then I'd like you to think, what was the point of the story? And I would pause the video and write the answers to these questions and make sure that you have read that story because that's important. When you think about that book, that story, one of the things that I get from it, among other things, is the importance at a very fundamental level of caring for small animals. And there's several Dena'ina stories that get to that idea. But this importance of being good to animals. That doesn't mean we don't hunt or kill them sometimes, but being good in how you treat them, right? There's a kind of opposite of this mouse story where there's a young man who does kind of the opposite. He is throwing mice out far away and crushing them. And then he has a terrible dream where he realizes that he has been so mean to the animals. And now Kunta Jalen, this mother figure is now upset with him. And so there's this idea of a respect for animals, and specifically a common idea in some of these stories is that when we show respect for animals, they return to us. That when you hunt, it is not just a relationship of sort of predator and prey, of somebody catching something, but that the animals in a sense choose to come back to your village and choose to allow themselves to be hunted. And that only works if you're keeping your end of that relationship of respect and reciprocity. Among other things, traditionally people would burn bones of land animals and put water animals' bones back in the water The idea being that that would allow their spirits, their essences, to go back to the world of spirits and then come back again the next year, right? In a process that we might think of in sort of a reincarnation sense, although that is not a Dena'ina term. Either way, kind of a return, whether that's a reincarnation in the sense that we might think of that term, or whether that's more of just like kind of the continual ecological cycling of populations, but the idea that you show respect and then animals return the next year. So we learn there about how people see nature is working, right? We also learn from these stories about how people gained knowledge, their epistemology, among other things from the old Dena'ina beliefs reading, right? We learned that there were people that were Ketch-Uptanen, true believers that gained knowledge by spiritual reflection, by things like thinking, by things like dreams, by things like looking to the stars, by things like drinking sips of water and thinking about their intentions, right? That there was a path, a quest, a process by which one gained spiritual knowledge. You might try an article called The True Believer Among the Kenai Peninsula Dena'ina if you're interested in delving more into that. And we also learn from stories like these about kind of what matters to people. And among other things, with the mouse story, we saw that hard work does matter. The guy is criticized for not being hardworking, but even more important is sort of how you treat other beings, including other animals. So I hope you found those interesting. By the way, this is a complete kind of an aside that probably should have come earlier in the lecture, but you've heard me say now several times phrases like traditional culture. That's a complicated term. It's a very imperfect term that could be debated in a lot of ways, but basically for a 200 level anthropology class, we use that term as a convenient term to talk about the way things were in a culture prior to colonialism. And it may be that some of those things are still going on today, right? But also some of them may have changed, right? People no longer live in midship. People do still definitely fish salmon heavily in Dena'ina communities. So traditional, right, is a term we use sometimes to denote like practices that go back a really, really long time. I like this quote from the Peter Kalfwinski reading, whatever is on this earth is a person, and that also gets translated as has a spirit, they used to say, and they said they prayed to everything. That is the way they lived. So this idea of sort of a sentient environment around them where plants, animals, and have spirits that have to be understood. When you go to the mountains, as another example, you would give like an offering, among other things, of some dried fish eggs or other things to what were considered the mountain people, to make sure that your hunt was successful and that you were being respectful of the sort of residents of the mountain while you were up in the mountain hunting sheep or other things. So this is a really good example of how sort of stories shape worldview, right? So 300 years ago, you grew up hearing stories like the mouse story. It's gonna probably shape how you think about animals and plants. And at the same time, the worldview, of course, shapes the stories, right? The worldview pops up in stories, and by reading the stories, we can learn a lot about people's worldviews. In all of this, there's the idea that the social world and the environmental, ecological, animal, and plant world are intimately connected. They're not separate things, and that very much we're in a social relationship with animals and plants, a relationship that if we honor, things go well, and that helps the cycle to keep going, right? Sometimes in sort of modern society, we tend to focus a lot on this idea of progress, right? We're moving forward and things are changing. In traditional Dena'ina society, there was a lot of emphasis on the past and the idea of we continue what has always worked and what has always been done. And that would have been helped in part by Ketch-Uptanen, right? People that had gone through the effort to learn spiritual knowledge that would teach people about sort of this is how we treat the world. And these are the practices that we follow. People like Ashok, like dreamers, like sky readers, like Anen or doctors, people such as shamans. We've already talked a bit about that, so I won't go into that. So all of that then tells us a little bit about what life would have looked like in Dena'ina 300 or 400 years ago in a village, fishing salmon, gathering a variety of berries and other plants, hunting a variety of animals, looking to catch Elnena for wisdom, relying on a Geshgas to help care for the community. There's more we could have talked about, but that's a good chunk of it. And I wanted to give you a bit of a flavor of things. Of course, if you live in the YK Delta, like Bethel, there's a whole other story we could tell about 300 years ago that involved the Yupik, and we'll be talking about them next week. If you live out on the Aleutian Islands, there's a whole other story we could tell about Onondaga society and what things would have looked like 300 years ago, and we will be talking about that next week. But I wanted to kind of start with this one, partly because of being kind of place-based, that for many of us, most of us in the past, we live on Dena'ina land. So it's worth thinking about what things looked like 300 years ago. You can't really understand anything that came after if you don't understand where things were. But of course, in talking about that, I want to emphasize that Dena'ina culture is not past tense. I was talking about what Dena'ina culture looked like 300 years ago, but it's not as if it disappeared. And one of the reasons I had you do the readings from either Kenaitze or Nick or Flutna, I gave you 3 options. All of those are modern tribes with many Dena'ina descendants. And I wanted you to get the sense that Dena'ina culture is ongoing and still vibrant and important, so that you could kind of see that although we're talking about the past, this is something where this is a living and ongoing culture. And that's very important for us to understand. Today, there are 19 official villages and 3 regional corporations of Dena'ina people. So why isn't this what life looks like on the land now? Why have things changed so much? And part of what we'll address next time when we talk about a difficult but important topic, which is colonialism. So see you there.